Dear students, in this video I would like to discuss Part A of Module 6 titled The Subaltern-Regional Paradigm. Part A is titled What Did Literary Histories Say to You? And that essay is written by Pradeepan Pampirikunnu. In the introductory paragraph of this essay, the author talks about the writings of history and the politics behind the writings of history, and he slowly comes to the writings of literary history and the power politics behind the writings of literary history. What do we understand by literary history? Literary history gives an account of the historical development of literary writings in a particular region or language. It relates, compares, and categorizes poetry, prose, drama, and other writings of authors at various periods. It also traces the literary techniques used throughout the various ages of writing. So in this essay, Pradeepan Pampirikunnu is talking about the writing of literary history. So let us see what is there in the essay. History writing is not merely an innocent desire to document the past. Why does he say so? It is related not only to justice but also to power. The consideration of power always depends on the law's focus on laws. Social powers also predicate and perpetuate unwritten and written aesthetic rules very much in their own interests. So here we find an explanation of writing history. What is there behind the writings of history in general? Why is history writing not an innocent desire to document the past? The answer is given here. It is related not only to justice but also to power. So writing of history is related to power. Power in the sense who writes the history is determined by the persons in whom the power rests. Persons with power or people with power are people in authority. They are the makers of law. And sometimes there is a tendency that the lawmakers, they govern the people according to their own interests. So let us see what is there. The consideration of power always depends on the law's focus on laws. Social powers also predicate, perpetuate unwritten and written aesthetic values, aesthetic rules very much in their own interests. So what is happening? Those authorities who have power to write history, they tend to predicate. What is the meaning of predicate? It is there in your glossary, page number 154. Predicate means to put before, to determine. So they have the capacity to determine, perpetuate. Perpetuate means cause to spread widely, popularize, spread it, determine, spread it. What? Unwritten and written aesthetic rules. Aesthetic. What do we understand by aesthetic? Aesthetic means a set of principles underlying the work of a particular artist or artistic movement. So there are some written or unwritten features, for the aesthetic. And these unwritten and written rules are sometimes determined and also popularized by those in power. And they will be determining and popularizing it in their own interests. By the same process, social powers also degrade and debase aesthetic knowledge productions outside their own interests. So there is a tendency that these social powers degrading and debase in the sense downgrading some artistic works. And that is also done according to their own interests. So what happens as a result? Hence, descriptions such as Sanskrit or Prakrit, literate or illiterate, classic or folk are also signs of marginalization. Here, the author is talking about another realm of discussion. Why does the author regard binaries like Sanskrit or Prakrit, classic or folk as signs of marginalization? Why? Because these binaries are set up by the social powers who work according to their own interests to popularize or to degrade or to debase certain writings. After categorizing people into varnas or castes, looking at those who were outside the system of varna dharmas, wondered as to who these beings were. After all, power is hardly reflexive about its own knowledge aesthetic self-constructions, given that the natural order of power does not exist. So this is the weakness of the social powers who create history. They hardly realize the knowledge aesthetic self-constructions they make. As the common mass thinks, power does not flow naturally. It flows according to the interests of certain social powers. The notion of a human hierarchy is merely an interpretation of power. So, what do you understand by hierarchy? Hierarchy means, it is there given in your glossary, page number 154. System of persons or things ranked one above the other. So hierarchy is a system of ranking people or things belonging to the lower level to the higher level. It is a system of persons or things ranked one above the other. So who determines this hierarchy? This hierarchy is determined by the people in power in the society. And they will be determining this hierarchy according to their own personal interests. It is through self-interpretations that man, synonymous with Brahmin, colonized the earth. So here a comparison is made between two terms, Brahmin and man. Man is there in the apex level of this hierarchy. Brahmin is also there in the apex level of caste system. So there is a tendency to equate these two concepts, and these two persons tend to colonize the whole earth. So that is one of the interpretations of the hierarchies being made by the social powers. Such exercises also alienated the knowledge of the first indigenous peoples. So if the social powers are making such hierarchical orders, then some group or some sects in society will be isolated or alienated. Which sections of society? The indigenous peoples of a particular society will be alienated or marginalized. According to Foucault, the urge to construct history through interpretations is the disguised desire for power or knowledge itself. So there is a reference to Foucault. Who is Foucault? Michel Foucault. He was a French philosopher, historian, writer, political activist, and literary critic. Foucault's theories primarily address the relationship between power and knowledge and how they are used as a form of social control through societal institutions. So here, according to Foucault, the urge to construct history through interpretations. History has to be analyzed through interpretations. And that particular activity is the disguised desire for power or knowledge itself. It is power that hegemonizes a particular form of the aesthetic. What is the meaning of hegemonizes? Hegemonize in the sense create predominance. It is power that hegemonizes a particular form of the aesthetic. It is what we have just told about. The social powers, they make who should come in the apex position and who should come in the lowest position. Power determines a particular form of the aesthetic, which in turn determines interpretation and appreciation. So if we have to understand history, it has to be understood through interpretations. But these interpretations are also determined by people in power sometimes. Such predeterminations became the yardstick to measure literary merit and were canonized as literary history. Now we are slowly coming to literary history. Literary history is also determined by or devised by or written by such social powers with their own political interest. Thus, literary history is simultaneously a justification as well as an institutionalization of a particular form of the aesthetic. So there is a word called institutionalization. What is the meaning of that? Institutionalization means the action of establishing something as a convention or norm in an organization or culture. That is the meaning of institutionalization. So we are setting up a code of law. We are setting up a norm, a set of norms for a particular activity that is happening in the society, or for a particular cultural mode or an artistic mode. We are setting up a set of rules or norms. Such a process of setting up or establishing certain conventions or norms for a particular kind of artwork or culture is called institutionalization. Here, what is referred to? Thus, literary history is simultaneously a justification as well as an institutionalization of a particular form of the aesthetic. So, literary history results in a kind of institutionalization of a particular aesthetic. Its judgments are hardly impartial or in the interests of the general populace. This paragraph has begun with a sentence. What was it? History writing is not merely an innocent desire to document the past, as the innocent people think, as the general populace think. Just like that, the writing of literary history is also not impartial, as the general populace thinks about it. It is not in the interest of the general populace also. So here in the introductory paragraph, we get an idea about history writing, the politics behind history writing, and also aspects of the writings of literary histories, the power politics behind it, the institutionalization and judgments and interpretations behind the writings of literary history. Now I am proceeding to the next paragraph. Any literary work is a sign structure and can only be interpreted, not immortalized. So in this paragraph, Pradeepan Pampirikunnu is talking about the hegemonic structures of interpretation. Traditional literary histories limit texts within the hegemonic structures of interpretations. So he is criticizing the traditional literary histories. And in this paragraph, in the first sentence, he is talking about a literary work, how a literary work has to be conceived. Any literary work is a sign structure and can only be interpreted, not immortalized. It's a very important statement. When we go through literary history, we find a lot of literary works and we get meanings out of these literary works through interpretation. So there is no need for immortalizing a literary work. Okay, immortalizing meaning conferring enduring fame upon a particular literary work. So what is the meaning of it? There is a tendency for the social powers to confer some greater significance to certain texts and consider some other texts as inferior to certain texts. So the immortalization is not needed according to this author. Okay, we have to interpret the different text. So we don't have to immortalize the different text. Why does he say so? A text survives through history and time because of its various interpretations. But established literary histories tend to trivialize such interpretational possibilities by institutionalization and imputation of immortality into the texts. This is the reason for the question, how do traditional literary histories limit the meaning of a text? How do they limit? They tend to trivialize. Trivialize meaning making silly. Trivialize such interpretational possibilities by institutionalization and imputation of immortality into text. So if we make some aesthetic with a set of norms or a set of rules, we are actually limiting the perceptions of that particular aesthetic. If we are giving importance to some of the literary texts, then we are discarding some others and making some as prominent. So these two activities are done by the traditional literary history according to our author. And this activity will limit the interpretation of the different texts. By enshrining a text in a particular period of time by virtue of its supposed singularity of signification, such literary histories preclude the potential for other reading. By enshrining a text in a particular period of time. So, when we discuss literary history, we are placing certain texts into a particular period of history, some other text into the other period of history. So if we make such period wise division of the texts, what will happen? There is a tendency to preclude, to avoid, or to preclude means avoid in advance, to avoid some other readings of the texts. We are just limiting the interpretative possibility of a text. Thus, literary histories limit these texts within the hegemonic structures of interpretation and appreciation. Even the most radical of texts is often mummified by literary history. What is the meaning of mummified? Fossilized or frozen. Even the most radical of texts is often frozen by literary history. Revolution thus becomes a museum artifact. Artifact meaning an object or a thing. An object made by a human being, typically one of cultural or historical interest. So, revolution is only just an object that has to be kept in a museum or anything like that. Revolution doesn't happen if we think in the line of the traditional literary history, because it has some power politics behind it. And the traditional literary history is governed by some social powers which institutionalizes and makes prejudiced judgments on their different interpretations. So with this, I conclude this session. We will be continuing our chapter in the next session. Thank you.